4 is looking at Cain's family tree. So we'll start off there. Start off at verse 8 is, I think, where we left off.
Where are we, brother?
Genesis chapter 4, and we're going to start out with 8 through 16. Okay.
Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "And am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael was the father of Methuselah, and Methuselah was the father of Lamech.
All right, so obviously we know the story about Cain killing Abel here, but we talked a little bit last week about, what was wrong with Cain's sacrifice, and the fact it was probably Cain's attitude. And we can kind of see that continued here. God says, "What have you done?" And Cain really doesn't show any remorse here at all. It's just, well, am I my brother's keeper? And when God gives him this punishment, again, Cain's concerned about his punishment, but he shows zero remorse at all about the fact that he killed his brother. So I think that gives us a little more insight, perhaps, into why Cain's sacrifice wasn't acceptable. Is just his attitude, right?
He was remorseful about losing his ability to be in a relationship with God. So he cared about God more than his brother.
Well, it seems.
I will be hidden from your presence.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So he seemed to care about his relationship with God, but he didn't seem to care about his brother at all.
Yeah. So it is kind of interesting there that just Cain's attitude is not what we would expect after killing Abel. And God kind of at first, God does show him some mercy here by when he says this is more than I can bear, and God says, well, because people are going to somebody's going to kill me, right? But God says, no, I won't let that happen. So at least God shows him some mercy here, but his attitude is not good, obviously.
This is so very abbreviated. Have you noticed here? If Cain and Abel were the first 2 children, Cain's already looking into the future regarding the earth being filled, more filled than it was at his time, because we have here families coming on, and the idea is, right at the moment, if we understand it correctly, he has no one to worry about.
Well, he doesn't. So we don't really know at this point. We know that Cain and Abel were likely the only 2 sons at this point, but we don't really know that.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
Another thing.
most likely, well, almost, not most likely, Adam and Eve had to have had daughters also, because we'll get into it a little bit later. Well, Cain got married, right? So,
But how much later?
well, but the only place that he could have gotten a wife was
Amen.
from a sister, right? So obviously, Adam and Eve had other children, at least daughters. It doesn't really, we don't really know. It kind of implies that Cain and Abel were the only sons here, but it doesn't say that directly, so there might have been other sons. It is possible. But,
I was thinking about the verse 14 and Andy's comment, and it's interesting because I kind of look at this a little bit different, and Andy's a lot smarter than I am, so I'm probably wrong. But when I think about what he says to God, he says that you've driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden, I'll be a vagrant. I see selfishness in that comment. I see a continued display
Amen.
of concern about not having God's protection anymore, meaning the eyes will not be on him. But then I also see where he's worried about the ground is no longer going to produce to the fullest like it would if I had your love and your eyes on me. And he was more concerned about that, not in my view, not necessarily about his relationship with God. It was more about what was in it for him.
when I read it, I kind of, that was kind of my impression is that he was concerned about your presence not being on me as in more of a protection kind of thing, but we don't really know. Stan?
What we just were talking about, other children, in Genesis 5, verse 4, after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. So there it brings out that over those long years, there were a lot of other sons and daughters, and they were marrying, and it was starting to fill the earth.
Yeah.
And it could have been quite full at the time that Cain said this, actually. We don't know. You're right. But it could have been.
Yeah.
And Cain went off to build a city, so
Yeah.
Yeah. Houston?
I was going to add something about the city. I was reading some Christian sociologists from the 60s this afternoon, and he brought up this story, and it was something I never thought about before, and he talked about Cain building the city as further rebellion. Where God tells him that he's going to be a wanderer upon the face of the earth, but instead he chooses to stop and build a city. And this guy's reflection was that it was a rebellion against trusting in God's security. God has already told him, "Hey, I'm going to put this mark upon your head. I'm going to keep you safe." But instead of trusting in that safety and accepting his curse of being a wanderer on the earth, he puts security in his own abilities by forming this fortress of a city in which he can derive his own, economic security and protection and kind of control that little area, which I thought was really interesting. So, I think to Mark's point here is there's not really a lot of redeeming qualities about Cain as the story goes on, especially when you see the building of a city as further rebellion. He never really turns around here.
Yeah. I guess his one redeeming quality is he understood God's command to fill the earth, that was going to happen. So, but other than that, you're right. And doesn't seem to have too many redeeming qualities. Bob?
At that particular time when Cain killed Abel, how much did he know about what to do and what not to do? He was in a learning process too. And there hadn't been any murders or anything up until that time. I asked him what he did. He was human. He said, "Oh, what's wrong with that?"
Yeah, well, there's no record of God telling them right or wrong, but there's also no record of God telling them what he expected for sacrifice, and obviously
Right.
Cain.
It was a learning process is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
From the day one, it's been a learning process, and we're still learning today.
I don't know, I don't see God as a God who would punish someone for doing something that he didn't give them the ability to understand was wrong. So, it was a learning process, but obviously Cain had to have had the understanding of what he was doing was wrong.
You know,
Otherwise, God wouldn't punish him for that, right?
When he gave the
But-
10 Commandments, that's when he told them, thou shalt not kill.
Well, yeah,
And
Right.
this early part of Genesis is sort of interesting because we don't see this idea that anybody felt guilt,
Right.
right? You know, we know guilt exists and it's part of human nature. And so it has to have been in us from the beginning, or at least from once the tree of good and evil was
Yeah.
revealed. But guilt doesn't seem to play in terms of an emotion, doesn't seem to play a role in anything until we get way up in the book here. You know, so we're appalled that he doesn't express any remorse or guilt about killing his brother, but you know, certainly past Noah, we're not seeing anybody express that as part of how they think.
I think it was being more childlike. They had a relationship with God. He was there, just like you're there with your kids all the time. And their first reaction when they get in trouble is to lie, to hide it, because they don't want you to know. And that in itself shows some sort of guilt, whether or not they're sorry they did it versus they're sorry they got caught. But he obviously didn't say, yeah, I killed my brother. So he was hiding it by his wordplay.
Well-
my brother's keeper. So he knew he did something wrong.
right. That's a good point. If he didn't know killing Cain or killing Abel was wrong, he would have said, yeah, you know. When God said, "Where's your brother?" he would have said, "Well, I killed him." You know. So obviously he had the knowledge that what he did was wrong.
Whether the maturity was there to feel guilt for it. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and God actually said, if you're not careful, sin's crouching at the door waiting for you. So there had to be some acknowledgement of what sin was and what potentially, action could create enmity between he and God.
I
Certainly before the time of Noah, no one felt that, you know, okay, yeah, sin, great, let's go. Everything we do is sin. This is good. I don't know that they saw it as a bad thing.
Yeah.
Why they had to get wiped out.
Right. Stan?
We're made in the image of God, and to me, that definitely implies that we have some kind of moral sense within. It's innate. We're born with that. And it may not be well defined. Obviously, when God reveals His will, we understand that. But over in Romans somewhere, I can't
Chapter
remember where
1,
it's at right
brother.
now, it says that before the law was given, there was sin. So sin existed just because something within us knows that certain things are wrong. Even though maybe God hadn't expressed the 10 Commandments or whatever, they're still counted as wrong before God because we have that moral sense within.
Yeah.
I go back with the parent and children thing. A lot of times our kids know we say, don't do this. They don't understand the full consequences of what would happen if they did it. And they don't understand why we tell them not to do it. A lot of times after when you're punishing, like, I told you not to run in the street because a car could hit you and you could get killed. Oh, that's why you didn't want me to do it. I'm like, it should have been enough I told you not to do it. And I think that's what you get a lot back then. They didn't think about the full repercussions of it, just as much what they wanted to do. And that doesn't make sense to me, so I'm going to do what I want to do.
Yeah. Gary?
Romans 1, now this is for all mankind coming along in the period of time. Let me get it. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, so on and so forth. And Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve had one-on-one communication with God. God had really explained to them what they were to do to please Him, and all the way through they chose not to do so. Now we come down to the end of it, chapter 4 or wherever it is. Yeah, at the end of chapter 4, you're going to get to it. Things, because of the teaching and because of the, I'll just say the teaching and the family aspect of it, they began to turn back to God and look to God. I don't know how long ago, I forget how long a period that went on, but at least that part of it was beginning to take place.
Yep. All right, well, one more comment, and then let's move on.
I think it's also important to remember why these things were written down. And, you know, I think when Moses was writing down these stories, he was giving the people of Israel examples to look back from, to be able to say, okay, don't be like Cain, you know, be like Noah. Don't be like the people of Babel, you know, be like Abram. And I think what we see here in these early chapters are lots of simple little stories that would be passed along very easily. You know, when you're telling your kids bedtime stories, you know, imagine the Israelites out in the wilderness telling stories to their kids. They're telling them the stories of Cain and Abel. They're telling them the stories of you know, Adam and Eve in the garden. And it's the I think part of the reason we get these simplified descriptions is because it's kind of like the parables of Jesus. You know, we're supposed to get some big ideas out of these things that could be applied, you know, to their lives and again to our lives about what sorts of things does God accept, what does He not accept, what does relationship with God look like, and I think we have to understand this in that context too.
Yeah, I think we're used to, you know, reading a novel where it gives us all kinds of details about what the characters are thinking and what they're feeling, and that's one thing with especially the Old Testament. Jewish literature doesn't work that way, right? It rarely does it tell us what they're thinking or what they're feeling. Jewish narrative usually pretty much just tells us what happened, right? So it doesn't give us the details that we're used to getting. So yeah, I think sometimes we feel like we're missing out on something because we don't have all these details that kind of our culture tells us we should be getting. But that's not it. All those details weren't necessary to be passed on for us to know what the story was, right? So, all right, let's read 17 through 21. Somebody read that, 17 through 21. Or sorry, 17 through 22. Gary?
And Cain knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. So Enoch was born Irad, and didn't we read that?
Well, yeah.
I went too far.
Yeah, you just keep going.
Irad begot Mehujael, and Mehujael begot Methuselah. Methuselah begot Lamech. Then Lamech took for himself two wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the second was Zillah. And Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. And as for Zillah, she bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah, I believe it's pronounced. So that's in 22.
Yep. So there's actually quite a few things going on in these few verses here. First, talked a little bit earlier. One of the things that opponents to the Bible will point out is well, hey, where did Cain get his wife? You know, that doesn't make any sense because there was, at this point in time, if Adam and Eve were the first two humans created, and nobody else was created at that time, where did Cain get his wife? And that's one of those arguments you'll hear about people attacking the Bible. Well, the simple answer is Cain's wife was his sister. And like I said earlier, it didn't tell us anything about Adam and Eve having other children, but I think we have to assume that they had daughters.
Chapter 5, verse 4, after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters.
Right. Well, so if you're trying to make this chronological, right, then you'd say, oh, well, wait a minute, that wasn't until after Seth was born, but again, there's this that's something we have a hard time getting to because of our culture. Is the Jewish literature kind of goes back and forth between events. Like we read this whole genealogy of Cain, and then it jumps backwards to talk about Seth, right? So these things are overlapping, and you're right. So when did Cain get his wife? Well, that might have been before Seth was born. It might have been after Seth was born. We don't know. But we know for sure after Seth was born that Adam and Eve had many more sons and daughters. So either way, the logical explanation here is Cain's wife was his sister. Then people will say, oh, well, that's horrible. That's incest. Well, no. At the time, there was no prohibition against marrying your sister. And why do we have a prohibition against that now? Well, it's all goes back to genetics. That throughout time, your gene structure, you have bad genes that get passed on. And if you were marrying your sister, you have a much better chance of you both having the same bad gene, which would cause birth defects, right? Well, this is at the very beginning. Adam and Eve were perfect. Their genes were perfect when they were created. So this chance of passing on a bad gene was much less at this point in time of the world. And we don't get God doesn't give them a prohibition against marrying a close relative until Moses. That's the first time we have that prohibition. And in fact, like Abraham marries his half sister, and that's not a big deal, right? Again, we have to understand their culture at the time and what God had told them versus understanding it in the light of our culture. Our culture would say, oh, you can't marry your sister. But that wasn't what the situation was when Cain was alive, right? So anyway, don't take that as a bad thing that Cain married his sister. That was his only option at that point, right? So, any comments on that?
Well, a sister or a niece or a great niece.
Well, okay. You have a good point, Gary. It could have been, maybe it wasn't, if he got married after Seth was born, it could have been a niece, or it could have been a further generation too.
The Cain lived, what was it?
800 years.
910 years.
Right. Okay, so anyway, it was a close relative,
Yes.
whatever it was. The next thing that's going on here, we already talked about, was the fact that Cain built a city, which I guess for him was, as Houston pointed out, that was, in one aspect, it was kind of showing more rebellion against God, but it's also a little bit understandable because he was the guy that was out, his skill was growing crops, and basically God said, well, I've taken that skill away from you. So I guess from his standpoint, it would be logical to start a city instead. But again, it was kind of a bit of a rebellion towards God. Later on here, it talks about, the world will say that early man was, the Neanderthal and caveman with a club and didn't have any tools or anything like that. And here we have just, 2 generations in, we've got a guy named Jubal who's creating stringed instruments, and Zillah, Tubal-Cain, who's forged tools out of bronze and iron. So it really kind of gives us a little different picture of early man than the world would give us. Obviously, God gave them talents to create things that our culture will tell us that early man didn't have those capabilities, right? But here's right, you know, not very many generations after Adam and Eve, the ability to create a stringed instrument, that's you know, takes some artistic ability and some technological ability to be able to do that. So.
Genetic in a big way.
Yep. Well, we were created in the image of God, right? And that's one of those things, the ability to be creative. And again, that's one of those arguments that people have against how did Noah build the ark? He didn't have the technology to do that. He wouldn't have had tools. And well, here it tells us right here that they already had tools of bronze and iron. It is just kind of an interesting insight that God gives us into the fact that early man wasn't this Neanderthal caveman that the only tool they had was a club, right?
Brother, it might have been that individual, but not mankind.
Well, I mean, you would, if one of them has created tools, I'm sure they would have passed it on, right?
Sold it in the city.
What's that?
You would sell it in the city.
Yeah, be able to sell it in the city. So, all right, let's. Houston.
You point out God has given them these talents and these skills to grow and kind of continue to develop as His creation, as humanity. But what strikes me here about this kind of little poem that Lamech uses is that he's now using the skill that God gave him to kind of be artistic with words and stuff like that, to kind of, at least the way I read it, manhandle blessings from God, right? God gave Cain that ability to be avenged.
Hold that thought. Let's read those verses first. I was just about to get there. So let's read 23 and 24.
I can read that.
Okay.
Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times.
All right, so go ahead, Houston.
That was just kind of my point. Sorry, I mean, for some reason it was in my mind that we already read it. But yeah, I mean, I think God's giving them these skills and these passions and stuff, and poetry and song is already listed up there, and they're turning these things that God has given them to create beauty and to reflect His glory, and they're using it to bring negative things. In my mind, what He's doing here is He's trying to claim God's blessings without God giving it. I'm having a hard time putting this into words, but God gave Cain the protection of the 7 times thing, and Lamech is trying to claim that for himself without God having ever given that to him, because Lamech has gone out and killed somebody. And so now he's distorting this gift of poetry to claim things from God that God is not offered him, and kind of manhandle blessings from God like humanity seems to do all throughout the time.
Yeah. So here, obviously, Cain's attitude has been passed down to his descendants. And the fact that he's like, hey, I killed somebody, so I get the same blessing that Cain got for killing somebody. Which, obviously, that was not God's intent there. Stan?
One thing I see here is the proliferation of sin, multiplying sin. It's been worse. Because he says, Cain killed a guy, I've done worse. And he's bragging about it.
Yeah.
He's bragging about how that he killed somebody just for wounding him, And so it's starting to set up this proliferation, this multiplication of sin. By the time you get to chapter 6, the whole world is continually sinning in their minds and hearts, and God has to destroy it with the flood. So I think this is a setup of how the sin is making progress in the world.
Yep. And this, Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Contrast that to what Jesus told Peter, right? When Peter said, how many times must you forgive? And Peter told him 77 times, right? So it's quite the contrast from what God intended for that.
have a question now. In the other translations, this is the New King James. He will be avenged. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech seven. Now, to be avenged means to be freed from, or I get a reward for doing something. But God cursed Cain. What other reading do we have on that in verse 24? Instead of Cain, if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77. I might have looked that up years ago, but I certainly forgot.
Well, the NIV says avenged.
Avenged?
Yeah.
English Standard says revenge. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then what makes it sevenfold?
I think the
premise-
point,
The premise back in 15 uses the phrasing, will suffer vengeance.
yeah,
So that's when we're talking about avenged or revenge,
right.
it's the suffering of God's vengeance for the act.
So God will
Very
punish
good
you if you
point.
hurt
Thank you,
Cain.
brother.
So Lamech was seventh in line from Cain. So he's making this not reasonable case that I'm seventh in line, so the blessing that God put on Cain to be avenged 7 times, it'll be 7 times 7 because I'm seventh in line.
But part of what's going on here is this self-justification of the things we want to do. You know, Cain didn't really have a valid reason for killing his brother. In this case, Lamech's trying to claim that he had a valid reason and that he had been wounded by these people that he killed. So we start to build this, yeah, I'm murdering somebody, which is a sin, but it really isn't because I had justification,
Yeah,
right? And we do that all the time with whatever sin. We start to see ourselves in a better light than we really should.
yeah. Well, it's obvious that, like I said, Cain's attitude has been passed down and amplified by his descendants, right?
We have one country invading another for no good reason, but they think they're justified in their mind.
Yep. All right. Let's move on and.
Human nature hadn't changed much.
No,
Right. No, it hasn't. Somebody read.
There's just more of us.
Right. Somebody read 4:25 through 5:5.
Adam made love to his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and called him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them, male and female, and blessed them. And when he named them mankind, when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died.
All right. So here God gave Adam and Eve another son, Seth, who took the place of Cain as Adam's firstborn in order to carry on his line. And it's really interesting the contrast that is kind of given to Seth's line here in verse 26. It says, at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Quite a bit different description than what we get of Cain and his descendants. It appears that at least on Seth's line initially, they were faithful and calling on the Lord.
So what would we call this, a calm before the storm?
Yeah, I guess literally, yes.
That maybe sets up what you're gonna read in chapter 6 there, where the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, they married any of them they chose. So you got Seth's line versus
Worldly.
Cain's
minded.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that we'll get to that tonight, but that will be an interesting conversation when we get there.
A footnote in the ones that are on our pews says a potential rephrasing of call on the name of the Lord was to proclaim the name of the Lord, which to me is more of an evangelistic suggestion than a piety. Not like help us, but go tell other people, which if that's the case, it's interesting to think of this whole family that stems from two people and is maybe 3-4 steps removed, still needs to remind each other about the name of the Lord.
Yep. All right, so here it tells us Adam lived 930 years, and the next, the verses 6 through 32 describes Adam's genealogy up through Noah. We're not going to read all of that, but if you'll notice, all of these men that it talks about lived, all of them lived over 800 years. Which is obviously a bit different than today, right? You wonder why was it that they lived so much longer at this point than we do now? Obviously, the Bible doesn't tell us that, but there are a lot of things that would make a lot of sense due to the flood. When it talks about creation, it talks about the waters being separated from the waters and there being a firmament. That could have been some kind of heavy, thick cloud layer that covered the earth prior to the flood that would have caused a lot less radiation, solar radiation to come through, which would... there's a lot of aging effects that happen from solar radiation that we get, right? DNA damage from that. So those things might not have happened. This is total speculation, obviously. We don't know for sure. There's also some thought that because of that, maybe the atmospheric pressure on the earth was a lot higher back then, which would explain a lot of the fact that there were huge animals, huge plants, versus what we see today. So there are a lot of like scientific reasons why they would have lived a lot longer back then.
I mean, God made a perfect world. There was less disease, there was less illness, there were not all these things that sin and our creation brought into the world. But also, I always think it's interesting when you go through the genealogy that if you do the years, Adam was around like 6, 7, or more of these generations because he lived so long, even though they waited a long time to have kids. Some of these people, Methuselah, when he was born, Adam was still alive. These people still had the person that talked to God with them in their lives, depending on how much they had spread out, of course. But I mean, they still had semi-contact to God, whereas now we don't know anybody, that's actually talked to God. So that was kind of a different thing for them too.
Yeah, that was some interesting trivia about this section. One. Enoch, Noah's father, Adam was still alive when Enoch was born, if you do the math.
Not to be confused with Cain's Enoch.
Well, right, not to be confused with Cain's Enoch. That is a little confusing because Seth's lines, there are several people that have the same names as Cain's line. So don't get confused there, but...
Yeah, I've always liked the verse in 24. Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more because God took him away. And that's like the only example we have of somebody who apparently didn't die.
Yeah, well, so, yeah, well, I was going to get to that Elijah.
Yeah.
So let's read 21 through 24. So we talk about that. Somebody read 21 through 24.
Come on, folks.
Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him.
So, if you, when we get into chapter 6 and it's talking about the wickedness of the world and the flood and everything, if you do the math, God took Enoch right before the flood happened. So there was this great wickedness in the world, and there were. It says Noah was the only righteous one left. Well, Enoch, right, was obviously righteous also, and God took care of that problem by taking him up, without him dying, kind of like Elijah, before the flood. So obviously, Enoch passed that love of God down to Noah. That he obviously had. Another...
Sorry, I'm lost. You're saying that he took Enoch right before the flood?
Yeah, if you do the math, it's not very long before the flood where Enoch...
I thought it was like 569 years, at least. So, because if Enoch had 300 years, Methuselah lived 187 before he had Lamech, and 182 before he had Noah. So that's already 369. So that means that Enoch was been gone 69 years before Noah was born. And then Noah didn't have Shem, Ham, and Japheth until he was 500. And then later he made the ark, because then the kids were on the ark.
Okay,
Unless I'm lost.
Yeah, I looked at, looked up a graph that had all that, and maybe I was wrong on that. But,
I'll keep trying to...
How about Methuselah? Did he die?
Now, Methuselah, that's another interesting... Methuselah must have died in the flood, because...
And Lamech.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it Methuselah's name in Hebrew means his death shall bring? So the idea I've heard before is that he was the last righteous person, and that when he died, God was willing to open up the floodgates. So maybe he didn't die in the flood, maybe he died the day before the flood.
Well, so he died the same year as the flood.
The same year for sure.
He might not have died in the flood, but he died in the same year as the flood.
Because his name waiting, his death shall bring.
So.
Yeah, what's the old French saying? After me, the deluge, right?
Yeah.
Could have been about that.
Yeah.
There's a cute saying, how many of you know this? Who's the oldest man that ever lived, yet died before his daddy did? You got it? Okay, Methuselah lived 969 years, and he died, but his daddy was taken to heaven.
Oh, okay, I got it, all right. All right, so don't really have time to get into the next section, so just a couple other things. The Bible trivia here, Noah was the 10th generation after Adam, and it was, if you do the math, it was 1,056 years from when Adam was born to when the flood happened, based on this genealogy here. And another interesting thing was Adam was still alive when Lamech was born. Adam was still alive. So you can imagine how many grandchildren Adam must have had, right? You probably, if people saw Adam coming with his pictures of his grandchildren, probably people would, oh no, I don't want to hear this. So. It's quite kind of mind-boggling when you think about that, of how many generations overlapped back then before the flood. So, all right, so we're out of time, and I'll actually quit before I go on extra time tonight. Please bear with me. Lord, you're such an incredible God, Lord. We are in awe of your creation, and we thank you so much for your word and for telling us the story of your creation and giving us the knowledge to grow closer to you and to understand you better, Lord. Please help us in studying your word and help us to understand it in such a way that we can get to know you better, Lord. Thank you so much for all that you give us, and thank you most of all for your Son. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.